There is a belief that to succumb to emotional suffering, to grieve over a lost past, and not to fight against one's own despondency, is tantamount to cowardly fleeing the battlefield even before the battle has begun. But can the cruelty of a tragedy that occurred in the past be justified? And is it worth fighting for someone who lacks even a drop of sympathy? Our hero today is Angron, a gladiator who could never become the Primarch. Incubation capsules stolen from the Emperor's laboratory were scattered across planets of varying degrees of civilization. Due to the incomprehensible machinations of the warp, some of these remarkable children arrived at their adoptive worlds as infants, while others could already walk and even defend themselves from dangers. Angron was among those who emerged from the capsule on his own. The child was severely injured due to a difficult landing on the planet, Nuteria. He sustained several serious injuries and was bleeding heavily. He was surrounded by mountains covered with snow and ice, and the surrounding temperature was so low that the wounds on his body were cauterized by the frost. Almost immediately after his first step into the world, the boy had to run. Alien beings, whispering in an unfamiliar language, chased after him. The creatures were armed with sharp blades, which several times came dangerously close to the young Primarch's throat. At some point, the child decided to stop running and grabbed a stone. From his hand, several pursuers perished and the snow around was stained with blood. This changed their roles. Now fear settled in the hearts of those who just a moment ago relished the chase. The boy saw terror in his opponent's eyes and heard the accelerated beating of their hearts. The remaining enemies disappeared, not daring to engage in battle with the remarkable child. However, he was nearly out of strength. Severely wounded and weakened, he almost lost consciousness from exhaustion, but he heard cries coming from beyond his sight. The voices belonged to beings that remotely resembled him. With his last bit of strength, the child still managed to throw a stone at them, causing several cries. The figures were wrapped in furs and held items that shot at the boy with shining needles. The more poison substances entered his body, the harder it was to stand. Eventually, the child collapsed in the snow, his eyelids closing. Sparse sources narrating the events of those times cannot convey the details thoroughly, yet it is commonly believed that the first beings to attack the young Primarch and then flee from him were the Eldar. He regained consciousness in a huge pit filled with 100 other people. All of them were dressed in rags and were distinguishable from one another only by the marks of slave traders standing out on their emaciated bodies. The frightened people gazed at the pyramid situated in the center of the pit, with several tiers. Unlike the child, they understood the terrible ordeal that awaited them. Surrounding all this were stands filled with numerous spectators, and several silvery spheres floated directly above the arena, conversing with each other in cheerful voices. The boy realized that they were communicating in the same language as his captors, though he was not yet able to decipher its meaning. The crowd of spectators jubilantly screamed as poisonous liquid began to flow into the pit through special holes. The slaves in the arena quickly understood that the stream of acid would kill anyone unfortunate enough to find themselves within it, and began to scramble up to the first tier of the pyramid. Fearful people helped each other and reached out to those who were weaker. However, after the liquid had filled the entire surface of the arena, the flow did not cease. The acid rose higher, covering tier after tier. Thus, there was less and less space on the pyramid, and people had to cluster into tight groups. The first one, unable to keep his balance, fell into the acid, demonstrating to the rest how torturous death would be for those who couldn't fight for a bit of life-saving space. The poisonous liquid was capable of dissolving flesh and bone, but was so concentrated that the fallen person died slowly, drowning the space around him in agonizing screams. His agony was so intense that, listening to the dying man's screams, the future Primarch felt physical pain. However, the crowd of spectators felt the opposite emotions. People in the stands rejoiced, watching the death of their kin. The acid continued to rise, and the slaves on the pyramid began to view each other not as comrades, but as obstacles on the path to survival. Panic drove them to fight and kill, and humanity was replaced with animal instinct. But the more horrific the events on the pyramid became, the louder the crowd cheered. The boy did not want to confront the prisoners around him. People were throwing each other into the acid, but even together, they were not able to push the strange child to the edge. The more they attacked him, the stronger the desire to fend off the slaves became. But the boy remembered, the villains were not those trapped in the pit with him, but those who condemned them to this suffering. Therefore, he spent all his strength just to stand on his feet and fought using only a small part of his power. His goal was not to kill, only to survive. Defending himself from attackers, the boy broke their necks and skulls before dropping their bodies into the acid. By doing so, he hoped to minimize the slave's suffering. However, each new corpse left a wound on his soul and seemed to take away a piece of the innate goodness within the child. The last opponent, a huge, beast-like man, was unable to overcome the boy and fell into the acid, dragging him along. To save himself, the future Primarch was forced to push the opponent away and watch his slow death. The trembling and crying child remained the only survivor on a small platform amidst a sea of acid. The crowd erupted into joyful screams, and the flying spheres declared the boy the winner of the trial. The society of Nuceria lived in conditions of acute inequality, where a minority drowning in luxury ruled over millions of the impoverished. The primary levers holding the ever-hungry populace from rebellion were arena battles and the illusion of swift enrichment through gambling. Enthusiasm for gambling played a significant role in the culture of all strata. Ordinary people gazed upon the arena in the hope of ceasing to be destitute, while the wealthy, who had not worked a day in their lives, those dubbed high riders, dispelled their ennui through wagers. Spheres that had declared the winner approached the boy and attempted to ascertain his name, but received no response, even after several electric shocks. They conversed among themselves and addressed the audience, igniting its interest. People placed bets on literally everything, including whether the child could speak. The metallic spheres were drones, allowing the numerically small elite to participate in the thick of events without the risk of assault by the impoverished. They discovered that the owner of the boy, as well as the one who had bet on him, belonged to House Thalka, which had yet to give the child a name. However, learning that he was found in the mountains, the High Riders chose the name Angron, Child of the Mountain. In reality, the snow-capped peaks were dormant volcanoes, occasionally unleashing their hidden fury upon the planet. By giving the child such a name, the slave owners sought to spur the audience's excitement with hints at his potential future exploits. By this time, the superhuman intellect of Angron already understood the speech of the flying spheres. His first words were a phrase expressing astonished incomprehension. The child was horrified that the nightmare that had befallen him was merely a game, but no one even considered answering his question. For the High Riders, as for the audience, he was just another temporary toy. Angron, infuriated, lunged at one of the drones, which triggered a new wave of bets. This assault could not end in escape. Angron was struck with electricity and dropped back onto a small platform in the midst of that acid lake. The people in the stands were thrilled by the child's action, though they were disappointed that he did not fall into the acid. However, the slave owners were pleased by what they called the strength and passion embodied in Angron. This was deemed a favourable sign, as the boy would require all the strength in the world to survive the trials prepared for him. Such spectacles attracted a small number of spectators by local standards. The most massive and popular spectacles, involving many strong gladiators, were organised on holidays. At other times, ordinary slaves of all ages were kept in special caves, guarded by armoured automatons. These armed machines operated on the same principle as the talking spheres, carrying out the necessary physical actions for the slave owners without risk to themselves. With electric spear strikes, the automatons herded the slaves from room to room, forced them into the arena, and performed all other functions of invulnerable overseers. Soon after the first trial, Angron was sent into battle alongside a group of experienced gladiators. The boy watched motionlessly as the men argued over dilapidated equipment. Therefore, his legs gave way sooner than he decided to approach them. The only thing left to Angron before entering the arena was a helmet given by one of the older gladiators. During the battle, the child noticed that the most experienced fighters acted cohesively, forming groups and first eliminating the weakest. However, teamwork led to nothing, as, like before, the raucous crowd expected to see a single victor. The boy was bombarded with blows, but all of them were too slow, and at first he only dodged, waiting until the attacker was exhausted. It couldn't last forever, and eventually Angron was forced to kill the first gladiator. He took the dead man's axe and plunged into the battle, paying no attention to either the noise of the crowd or the blood that covered him from head to toe. His final opponent turned out to be the very gladiator who had shared his helmet with the boy before the battle started. This caused him to hesitate for a moment and miss a blade strike, plunging into his stomach up to the hilt. Raising the axe for a death blow, Angron couldn't hear the stands roaring, joyously shouting out his name. Similar fights repeated several times. The spectators enjoyed watching the child defeat many adult gladiators. The boy didn't have time to understand the surrounding world, and saw nothing but the icy mountains and the red sands of the arena. However, his heart ached with each forced killing. Angron didn't understand why people enjoyed cruelty so much and considered them monsters. However, the old gladiator Enormous, who took on the role of his mentor, explained to the child that monsters are not the impoverished people, but those who are on top in luxury and complete safety. They, not the common folk, deserved wrath. At the age equivalent to 10 years on Terra, Angron's height matched that of the largest gladiators. He was still a child, but fought faster and better than any other. Growing up among the gladiators headed for death, Angron acquired their worldview and meaning of life. The killings still caused him pain, but the boy no longer felt hatred towards the crowd. In their cries he heard delight and adoration. Only the flying spheres and the aristocrats of Nuceria hidden behind them deserved wrath. He began to perceive the fight as a ritual dance, where each opponent deserved a quick and painless death. In battles with renowned champions, Angron made efforts to restrain and provide the opponent with a prolonged duel, so the gladiator would be remembered as a strong warrior who accepted a worthy death. Such details formed the bonds of their strange brotherhood. Yet, watching as the body of the fallen was carried away, while he himself was shackled in chains, Angron felt shame, but envied the deceased. After all, he no longer needed to fight. Above all in the world, the public's favourite wished to end with the Red Sands and High Riders. However, not all performances ended in death. Gladiators brought their slave owners new riches, therefore their lives were not squandered daily. Deadly battles were held on feast days. On other days, the fights more often ended with the surrender of one of the sides. Warriors returned to their caves, where they inflicted on each other triumphal chains of scars linked into a single line, enumerating victories and defeats in red and black. Angron's chain was exclusively of red colour, but he assisted his brothers and sisters by marking their bodies with black scars. The giant did this with respect and care, not superiority. To keep the crowd from growing bored with monotonous, brutal scenes of killings from time to time, the High Riders forced the gladiators to battle against unusual opponents and monsters. Once, Angron had to fight against a female psyker, who transformed his axe into snowflakes and then incinerated other warriors and the flesh on the giant's hands. The sorceress, like many before her, did not want to fight. However, the world's masters spurred the woman on through an electric collar. With effort, the young Angron managed to destroy his opponent, but this death, like all the others, left an incurable wound on his soul. The giant's body grew stronger, and the High Riders had to resort to new, even more toxic substances to put the youth to sleep. Thus, after poisoning him with tranquilizers, the slave owners placed the unarmed Angron inside the belly of a giant sea worm. Another gladiator was also inside the monster. The audience was curious to see if the giant would outlive a normal human being. Such events occurred more than once. A slave was fed to the monster, and bets were placed on how many minutes he would last before suffocating and being digested. Contemplating a way to escape, Angron held his breath, leaving the oxygen for the weaker gladiator. The worm's insides were as hard as stone, but elastic. It seemed impossible to break through the beast's body without weapons. Then Angron decided to escape through the monster's mouth. He grabbed the nearly unconscious gladiator and started to crawl through the acid, overcoming the pressure of the monster's muscles. There was no air left. Caustic liquids burned the skin, but Angron continued to clamber upwards, not losing hope of saving himself and his comrade. Contrary to the spectators' expectations, the giant tore the worm's jaws apart and emerged to freedom, pulling out the lifeless gladiator with him. To Angron's horror, his fellow sufferer had choked on acid. The youth attempted to bring him back to life, providing the necessary aid, while the commenting spheres continued taking bets. Realizing that saving his comrade was impossible, Angron heard the mocking cries of the flying spheres. They scoffed at his pain and blamed him for the death. The giant's reverent attitude towards the lives of other slaves was one of the reasons he did not try to escape to freedom. The torturous existence weighed heavily on the souls of those forced to fight daily for their lives, and Angron eased their suffering by absorbing others' pain into himself through psychic touches. Had he desired freedom, the youth would likely have achieved his goal. However, this made no sense in a reality where the entire planet was engulfed in poverty and enslavement. Angron could not afford to leave the arena alone. Only together with the other gladiators could he possibly do so. Together with Enormous, who had taken on the role of a foster father, The mighty youth planned a revolt against the ruling elite of Nuceria. Yet their plans were not meant to come to fruition. During a grand show in the arena, 24 gladiators were released to fight against a group of beastmen. The arduous battle ended with the deaths of nearly all participants, except for Angron and his mentor. The crowd shouted in ecstasy, but the aristocrats watching the fight decided that the wounded warriors should enter into another, even bloodier battle. 2 massive berserk mutants were released into the arena, their heads disfigured by metallic implants that induced uncontrollable rage. Angron had heard of the monstrous battles against those transformed into monsters by the butcher's nails. Casualties in a single performance could number in the hundreds. Outside of battles, the mutilated gladiators were kept separate from the rest of the slaves, as anger was their only emotion, and all they consistently desired was to kill. In the fight against the berserk mutants, Angron had to fight for 2, as the injured Enormous could no longer defend himself. The youth took hits meant for his mentor and disregarded self-preservation. After 17 minutes of bloody combat, both mutants were eliminated. For the first time, the public witnessed a victory over those bearing the butcher's nails. Yet even this did not satisfy the bet-placing high-riders. Now they wanted the 2 strongest warriors of the arena, Angron and Enormous, to fight each other. The wounded mentor stood no chance against the giant, but the latter refused to fight. Angron raised his axe and directed it towards the gilded tribune. There, at the very top, sat the masters of the show. He refused to fight his mentor, but offered those he called cowards to quench their thirst for blood by coming down. Enormous was ready to die rather than provoke the master's wrath against Angron, but the youth declared that they had taken everything from him, and he would not let them take his foster father as well. This ignited pride in the heart of the seasoned gladiator, yet Angron's naive appeal could not be justified. The precedent of a slave daring to challenge his master could lead to destructive consequences for the entire Nuceria system. The aristocrats reacted in the most cruel manner, and the blood-intoxicated crowd supported them. The young Angron was sentenced to the nails. He was poisoned with chemicals almost to death and sent to the dark tower of the Technomancer, and after the torturous procedure, he was released into the arena once more. Angron's mind, mutilated by the barbaric procedure, lost memories of the days that followed. Covered in alien blood, the warrior regained consciousness only when he was irrevocably chained to a wall. The butcher's nails burrowed into his skull, and his skin burned as if with fever. His superhuman body attempted to heal the wound on his head, but it was already impossible. In such a state, Angron heard the cheerful conversation of 2 guards, counting their winnings after his last appearance. The most valuable to the young gladiator, his named father Enormous, perished. He spent his last moments in the arena in horror, watching his mind-lost ward. The butcher's nails transformed the youth, attentive to people, into a frenzied berserker. The pain of loss and the realization of his own guilt shattered Angron's heart. He could not break his shackles and kill the guards, but his scream, which lasted 3 days, circled all of Nuceria and was heard by everyone. The barbaric technology of the butcher's nails had a destructive effect on the human mind, depriving it of sanity, the ability to think and function. However, Angron had a unique physiology that allowed him to alter the mechanism of pain. Immediately after receiving the butcher's nails, the youth indeed turned into a crazed berserker, resembling those he had fought before. However, his superhuman brain managed to adapt, and the ability to think returned to him. The butcher's nails changed his very essence, turning him into almost the complete opposite of his former self. And yet, Angron did not forget about brotherhood and the escape plans devised by Enormous. With his unyielding code of honor, magnificent combat skills, and care for others, Angron had long earned his place as a respected leader of the gladiators of the capital. Therefore, when he proposed a bold and risky plan of liberation, everyone was eager to respond. During the next celebrations, grand battles were organized in the arena, in which absolutely all the gladiators participated. The crowd watched with delight as 2 groups of warriors prepared to annihilate each other. However, the gladiators no longer wished to kill their brethren. Instead, they attacked the guards, cutting their way to freedom through the guards and armored automatons. The disparity in armaments led to terrible losses, but 2,000 fighters managed to break free. Leaving the capital, the gladiators took with them as much weaponry and supplies as they could carry. They attacked the settlements they came across, exacting revenge on cruel people through killing and fire. For this, Angron's warriors called themselves the Eaters of Cities, and yet none but the High Riders had access to the most effective weaponry, and so the small army of rebellious gladiators continued to dwindle. When pressed by the elite serving troops, the Eaters of Cities retreated into the northern mountains, and their numbers were halved. The main defenders of the existing order were the Kin Guard. The cruel and indifferent soldiers, toward the plight of the impoverished population, were the only representatives of the common folk with whom the elite of Nuceria were willing to share the meagre crumbs of their wealth. The primary tool of the Kin Guard was the so-called silver vines, high-tech devices capable of performing multiple functions. Like the butcher's nails, they were implanted into the soldiers' heads, but they did not cause the wearer suffering and possessed amazing physical properties. The vines could act as armor, expanding and wrapping around a person to protect them from wind, cold, bullets, and axe blows. They could entwine only the legs, transforming into transport, swiftly carrying the soldier across the most challenging terrain. And they could even extend far ahead, creating reliable bridges with which squads cross chasms. This same device, when necessary, could trip gladiators in the arenas. The silver vines were controlled solely through thought. Angron knew this, and in combat with the Kin Guard, his first action was to tear the neural implants from the enemy's head. The universal devices were a formidable and dangerous weapon, but the warriors using them remained simple people. The squad of desperate Eaters of Cities continued to decrease, ultimately reducing to 56 individuals. The liberated gladiators perished first and foremost from harsh conditions and lack of supplies. They were surrounded by 5 armies and could not leave Deshelica Ridge, where they were hiding. While the weakened people tried to warm up in a mountain cave, Angron went hunting, hoping to find some food among the lifeless peaks for his brothers and sisters. He himself refused food, believing that he must alleviate the mortal's existence at any cost. But his sacrifices did not end there. When there was no food left, Angron began to feed the gladiators his blood. Not everyone could accept his gift, as it was filled with life force and too different from what flowed in the veins of ordinary people. But those who managed to assimilate the blood of the giant tried not to lose a drop. In this act, as in stripping the clothes from already dead comrades, lay an aspiration towards a cruel but necessary goal. The gladiators, who in the past knew nothing but fighting and death, now wished to survive to kill as many slave owners in battle as possible. Everyone knew that inevitable death awaited them, but no one harbored fear in their soul, and the world seemed beautiful to Angron and his comrades, because the warriors had finally gained freedom. The butcher's nails took a lot from the giant, but could not deprive him of his family. Now he could not share their sufferings through touches. Every time someone touched him, the nails punished Angron with a surge of pain. But he continued to care for the people, not allowing them to die from hunger, giving them his blood, and covering the sleeping with clothes taken from his own shoulder. The scouts of the Kin Guard discovered the location of the rebels and surrounded their position. The battle held significant importance for the world's masters, as the High Riders deigned to personally appear on the battlefield. Aristocrats sat upon a variety of flying platforms, each distinguished by an incredible array of extravagant decorations. Some were borne aloft on golden couches, others on massive floating hands or wings. All aristocrats wore animal masks inlaid with so many jewels that their worth could feed an entire country. Yet all this parade of vulgar luxury could not hide the fact that those named High Riders were weak and morbidly obese individuals whose power rested upon money and fear. Their presence signified that the Eaters of Cities had managed to inflict significant damage upon the elite, prompting the wealthy to personally oversee the destruction of the rebels. Angron sneered at making the world's masters worry, fully understanding that the aristocrats would never engage in combat and expose themselves to danger. The High Riders were not united among themselves and did not hesitate to quarrel even over the future battlefield. The only thing the world's masters valued was money. They knew nothing of brotherhood and had arrived in the mountains to force Angron to return. Lacking spectacles, the impoverished populace began to wonder why a few drowned in luxury, while the majority could not afford a piece of bread. The High Riders needed to return their mighty favourite to the people. They did not even perceive the rebellion as a real uprising. Detached from reality, the aristocrats called the events entertainment and thought they could bring back Angron simply by promising to forgive his escape. But, like the other gladiators, the giant considered death far more attractive than a life in chains. Angron was convinced that no one could ever make him do their bidding again. The warrior directed the blade of his axe at the leader of the High Riders, challenging him to combat. The gladiator knew he would die, but intended to spill a sea of blood before that. His brothers and sisters, whom he loved and protected, stood next to Angron, smiling and ready for the deadly battle. The High Riders understood that the rebels would not surrender, and immediately started to argue among themselves. There was no consensus among them, since each thought only of their own interests. A few minutes later, a decision, not agreed upon by all aristocrats, was made. The gladiators were sentenced to destruction. The High Riders did not intend to descend and engage in close combat. They didn't even resort to using the Kinguard soldiers. The 56 rebels were simply targeted with microwave blasters and sonic cannons, which destroyed half of the fighters instantly. The remaining warriors charged at the enemies, and Angron lost the ability to follow each one's actions. He managed to leap higher than anyone expected, and tore the aristocratic leader in half with his bare hands. When another flying platform appeared nearby, Angron raised his fist to kill a second villain, but his blow never reached its target. Time stood still, and the body of the giant froze in immobility. His senses and mind continued to function, but everything around was eclipsed by a blinding golden light. A voice belonging to someone unfathomable introduced itself as the Emperor and informed Angron that he was being taken to the stars. The warrior refused. He could not abandon his brothers and sisters in this suicidal and most crucial battle of his life. The Emperor expressed regret, and the gladiator almost heard sincerity in those words. The golden guards surrounding the Master of Mankind stepped towards Angron to detain him. The first among them was torn from neck to groin. The others aimed their lightning-sparking halberds at the giant's neck, but by that time he had found a vulnerability in each and was prepared to drench their golden armours in blood. The Emperor stopped him, stating that all that had transpired was regrettable. But they had too little time, and the Primarch must begin to fulfill his duties. Angron asked the Emperor why he simply did not help his brothers and sisters. Why, being so powerful, did he not descend from these golden chambers into the mud to where the real battle was happening? The Emperor replied that his gaze was set on an entire galaxy, not on wars with petty tyrants. He promised that by accepting the mantle of Primarch and leading his own fleet, Angron could share this viewpoint. But the warrior disagreed. He was seized by a nauseating feeling, similar to when he realized that the High Riders wanted to take him back to use him. The Emperor deprived him of a noble death because he needed him just as much as the planet's masters did. Then the gladiator said that the real him died down there, alongside his family, and all that the Master of Mankind could hope for was a shell, a ghost of Angron, who never left Nuceria. Hearing these words, the Emperor showed no emotion and simply teleported the newly found Primarch to the flagship of the 12th Legion, saying in farewell that a ghost would suffice to fulfill his duties. Later, learning about the histories of other Primarchs, Angron would find that to some of them the Emperor did indeed help to solve minor problems on their home worlds. He would be outraged that Lionel Johnson was allowed to elevate his close companions, Lorgar, an adoptive father, and Lemon Russ, to keep all his friends and relatives. Learning what the Space Marine legions entailed, Angron would rage, not understanding the reasons that prevented sending a group of his genetic sons to Nuceria to destroy the High Riders. His questions would never be answered, and the Primarch would give the answers to himself, harbouring a cruel resentment towards the Emperor in his soul. Angron could not understand the motives of the Master of Mankind, yet that did not render them any less significant. Before the descent on Nuceria, the Emperor had been observing the actions of the Primarch for several months, and one can only guess how difficult it was for him to make the final decision. The Master of Mankind did not help Angron, for which the Primarch blamed him for years. However, the former gladiator himself had never once visited his homeworld, showing no concern for the fate of the remaining population of Nuceria. Moreover, there was no need to bring the planet into compliance, as it was part of Ultramar under Rabut Gilliman, who had been found several decades earlier. Teleporting Angron to the ship with his genetic sons, the Emperor entrusted the duty of explaining the circumstances to the Space Marines. At that time, the 12th Legion was known as the Warhounds and was famed for its efficiency, ferocity, and ruthlessness. All battles involving the Warhounds could only end in two ways: a victorious slaughter or a simple extermination. Both options left the enemy with no chance for further resistance. The valorous Legion Master Ibram Greer, who had led the Warhounds for 30 years, was the first to enter the Primarch's chambers and disappeared without a trace. After him vanished the captains of 7 more companies and 2 standard-bearers, who had voluntarily entered the room to their genetic father. Pain and rage clouded Angron's mind. He was incapable of listening to the legionnaires, considering them his enemies and the Emperor's lackeys. He intended to destroy anyone who came, filling the room with their bodies before anyone could kill him. Angron viewed service to the Imperium as slavery to which he refused to return. All his thoughts were directed towards bloody vengeance against those who had stolen from him the opportunity to fulfill his oath to his true family. The warrior believed he would fulfill that promise and then join his kin in the embrace of oblivion. Commanders entered the Primarch's chambers one by one, fully aware of the fate that had befallen those who preceded them. Angron demanded the Space Marines fight him, but no one wished to raise a hand against their genetic father. Their submission and meek acceptance of death infuriated the Primarch even more. He could not understand that the warriors were not his enemies and killed them before they could explain the situation. Captain of the 8th Assault Company, Khan, managed to tell Angron that the Astartes could not fight him, as they had sworn to serve him. The Primarch assumed the vow was to the Emperor, but this was not the case. The legionnaires had sworn to each other. The information interested Angron, though he still could not comprehend how such warriors could willingly serve the Emperor, cloaked in gold. The Primarch saw no difference between the slavers of Nuceria, who forced gladiators to kill each other, and the Master of Mankind, who sent Space Marines to their death for his interest. During this conversation, Khan received many blows and nearly died. Angron hardly listened to him, constantly speaking of the fate of his fallen brothers and sisters. The Primarch believed the Emperor had made him an oath-breaker and, in the absence of equal foes, directed his fists at himself. The captain could only watch helplessly as Angron dealt himself a devastating blow. Brought to his knees and knocked down by his own fists, the giant promised that he would kill the Emperor, then told Khan of the arrogant masters of Nuceria. Throughout this ordeal, he continued to beat the Space Marine, who during the conversation had lost consciousness several times. Nonetheless, Khan was able to convey to Angron that he was not a slave but the master of the Legion, not imprisoned but aboard the flagship of his own fleet. The captain of the 8th Company succeeded in convincing the Primarch that the Space Marines were worthy to become his warriors. Angron relented and assisted the battered Khan. Together, they approached the Astartes, who greeted the long-awaited appearance of their genetic father with enthusiasm. Angron was the 17th Primarch to be discovered, and most of his brothers spent their initial years of service to the Imperium under the wing of more experienced legions. Waging war alongside an elder brother allowed the newly found Primarchs to familiarize themselves with the accepted tactics of conquest and bond with their legion before embarking on their own expeditions. Equally important was the communication with their peers, who could share their own experiences. Some Primarchs, such as Vulcan, were honored to spend their initial years of service fighting alongside the Emperor himself. However, this was not the case for Angron. The Warhounds were not sent to another legion, and the Primarch, never having been trained in warfare, had to decide on his own how his sons would conduct their wars. The Legion's garrison world was the planet Bot in the Segmentum Ultima. There, the Primarch assumed command and made several changes, including renaming the Warhounds to World Eaters, to honor the memory of his fallen gladiators and to emphasize the cruelty encouraged by Angron. The Primarch forbade being called by any title or term expressing hierarchical reverence, insisting on being addressed only by his name. Space Marines described Angron as a red-haired giant with light golden eyes. He had a face that could belong to a general or a teacher, for whom sages might fight for the privilege to sit at his feet. Were it not for the bitter circumstances of his youth, Angron could have matched in beauty with Lorgar, Fulgrim, or Sanguinius. However, rage distorted his features and turned him into a monstrous parody of a Primarch. The genetic father became the Space Marines' absolute ruler, surpassing in the eyes of many even the Emperor himself. Angron was a disfigured, broken, and perpetually enraged warrior, but his sons saw in him a great embodiment of a brutal ideal, awakening in their souls a devotion. Arenas appeared on the ships of the 12th Legion, in which warriors fought against each other, sometimes applying traditions inherited from Nuceria. Gladiatorial fights became a way for the Space Marines to entertain themselves, win additional glory, and settle scores. Additionally, the majority of the World Eaters soon began to adorn their bodies with triumphal rows of scars. The warriors were ready to do anything to become even slightly closer to their Primarch, who continued to set the long-deceased slaves of Nuceria as an example for them. The warriors seemed to Angron insufficiently fierce and did not inspire his respect, and the overarching goal of the Great Crusade did nothing to invigorate him. Therefore, after several years, the Primarch abandoned his legion. Captain Khan addressed each ship in the fleet, determining on which of them Angron was hiding. Despite sweeping every deck on each vessel, the Space Marines did not find their father. However, after a thorough scanning of the entire armada, the disappearance of one ship was discovered. Only after 2 years of searching, involving numerous warp jumps, did Khan manage to arrive at a world where Angron's hijacked ship was orbiting. It was a large vessel, capable of functioning autonomously for an extended period. But over 2 years, it had exhausted its resources. Several escape pods with crew members left the ship, likely in hopes of finding some sustenance on the jungle-covered world. The rest died of starvation aboard. Khan ordered all accompanying Astartes to return for the specialists necessary for the stolen ship's recovery. He himself went down to the planet's surface. Years ago, when Angron first joined the Legion, Khan had commanded the tech priests who were crafting the Primarch's armor to install tracking sensors within the bronze plates of the armor. The captain felt as though his action bordered on betrayal, as infringing upon the Primarch's freedom was unthinkable, but he deemed it necessary. Such an insurance seemed vital to Khan, in case Angron, blinded by pain, lost his way on board the Conqueror. The Primarch was found in a dark cave located in the most impenetrable part of the jungle. His flight was not without purpose. Angron sought a worthy adversary. The cave floor was strewn with the skulls of monsters. Local aborigines told the Primarch of places where creatures lurked, and Angron went there, hoping to meet an enemy capable enough to kill him. Khan was outraged by such an attitude towards life, and asked the Primarch why he did not kill himself by simply detonating the ship's core. This provoked another wave of furious screams, in which Angron lamented the fate of his brothers on Nuceria. The Primarch wished to die in battle, just as those he once abandoned to death. In his mind, the Emperor continued to be yet another slave master, whose orders Angron found demeaning. He wanted to die as he wished. Hoping to persuade the Primarch, Khan asked what the gladiators of Nuceria would say if they knew of his disregard for his sons. This enraged Angron, who valued not the genetic bond and refused to remain a slave, building another's dream. However, he agreed to return after Khan promised to do everything required to rid them of their own weakness. The Space Marines joyfully allowed the mutilation of their heads with butcher's nails. The warriors hoped that by crushing themselves on the same anvil, they would finally be able to unite with their father. Some said the implants increased aggression and tolerance to pain, making a warrior more powerful than an ordinary Astartes. The Primarch himself was certain of one thing: a warrior who desires to live is defenseless against one who does not care about death. And the warriors tormented by the butcher's nails did not cling to life. Angron allowed the Legion's tech marines and apothecaries to examine his implants so that they could create exact replicas for the Legionnaires. However, the expected results were not achieved. Velkeradar, an Archmagos with the 12th Legion, was stunned by what he saw and immediately reported his discoveries to the Emperor, who commanded him to keep the information about the Primarch's health a secret. After some time, the Master of Mankind himself inspected the sleeping Angron, meticulously studying the nature of his Archaeotech neural implants. When the nails activated, they reduced the production of the neurotransmitter known as serotonin in the subject's brain to encourage instinctive aggression, just as they deadened emotional responses and electrical activity to any other portion of the brain, save for that which regulated the flow of adrenaline. However, the superhuman physiology of the Primarch contended with this, and the implants burrowed deeper, undermining psychological stability and impairing cognition. The longer Angron wore the nails, the more they maimed him, leading to an inevitable and painful death. At the moment when the Emperor was examining the Primarch, thin tendrils of the nails were piercing all sections of the brain and were already descending along his spine, disrupting the nervous system's function. Absolutely any movement caused Angron pain, stimulating anger and rage which grew more intense with each passing day. Furthermore, the frontal lobe and insular cortex were not just mutilated by insertion. These parts were removed from Angron's head before implantation, and the nails replaced whole sections of brain tissue. The master of mankind, extracting the mechanism could only lead to the warrior's death. Though the fact that he still remained alive was a testament to the genius of the Primarch's creator. Everything caused Angron torment, including thinking, breathing, and any feelings except for rage. But the monstrous mechanism, permanently ingrained in his mind, could not be removed. The Primarch was doomed to suffer until his death, which, as the Emperor surmised, would soon occur. However, this was not a reason not to use Angron in the role for which he was created. The nails deprived the Primarch of the ability to be a tactician and strategist, but enhanced his aggression and combat effectiveness. Thus, he could still lead warriors into battle, and therefore fulfill the missions entrusted to him by the Emperor. Angron did not study the art of conducting large-scale battles, and the only thing he always relied on was personal strength. Therefore, he decided to give his sons what he was certain of: the nail. The Tech Marines could not recreate exact copies of the Primarch's implants, and it can be said with certainty that the suffering experienced by the modified Astartes was not as devastating. Although sufficient to make a warrior lose his mind and self-preservation instinct in battle, it was assumed that Butcher's nails would be received by every World Eater. However, during the implantation process, it was discovered that psychically gifted Space Marines could not survive the procedure and soon died. The sons of Angron were so eager to resemble him that they agreed to receive the nails despite the tragic fates of the previous Psychers. Thus the Legion lost almost all of its librarians. But this hardly concerned Primarch Angron and the Astartes who had already received the nails. The presence of Psychers caused pain to those who bore the implants, and for this reason the small group of librarians left without the pain mechanisms became outcasts. The simplest war methodology introduced by Angron demonstrated high efficiency. The reputation of the cruel and frenzied warriors preceded the fleet. Entire star systems surrendered upon barely hearing about the approach of the World Eaters. However, along with the legend of fearless fighters, dark tales of atrocities and senseless destruction emerged, troubling the Imperialis War Council and other Primarchs. Guilliman, who had fought alongside the World Eaters during the cleansing of Arigata, was appalled by the behavior of Angron and his Space Marines. Before the shocked gaze of the Lord of Ultramar, the 12th Legionnaires piled up bodies in a huge, monstrous ramp, which they climbed to breach the besieged fortress. Thanks to such escapades and endless bloody villainies, Angron earned the nickname the Red Angel, which he thoroughly despised. He had many nicknames, most of them pointing to cruelty, bloodthirstiness and madness. The name the Red Angel irritated the Primarch with its obvious parallel to Sanguinius, also known as the Great Angel, whom Angron didn't want to emulate. The Primarch didn't speak of it aloud, but the name Angron Thalka also caused him some irritation, as it was given by the slave owners whose surname he still bore. He knew that the Emperor had conceived another name for him, but he never asked about it. The Legion's numerous victories were won at a brutal cost. The situation was worsened by Primarch Angron's constant parallels between his dead gladiators and the current Legion. Angron ordered the conquest of worlds within 31 hours because that was the length of a day on Nuceria, and the same time his rebellious gladiators needed to burn a city. Primarch Angron was indifferent to the difficulties and unforeseen circumstances the Legion encountered. The task had to be accomplished without fail, and in case of failure, the World Eaters faced decimation. Such situations included the campaign to bring the rebellious planet Genna back into compliance. This world was technologically advanced, but its population suffered from severe genetic diseases. To preserve the lives of their last representatives, the planet's leadership created a system in which a few hundred people controlled millions of artificial bodies. After this event, the world ceased paying its tithe and severed all ties with the Imperium. The attempt to capture the planet within 31 hours was unsuccessful. The World Eaters fought ferociously, but an unarmed crowd of human-like beings overwhelmed the Space Marines in number. Angron had no intention of delving into the nuances or devising a strategy suitable for the given conditions. He simply decided to punish the errant Legion through decimation. The commander's refusal to carry out the monstrous order led to a burst of rage, during which Angron killed scores of his sons. He was only calmed by the intervention of United Librarians who plunged the Primarch into sleep. The mission on Genna ended in a mass slaughter, after which a faction of the World Eaters rebelled against the implantation of the Butcher's nails into their heads. The Space Marines intended to stop the bloody madness, subdue the Primarch and the warriors given to him, and then deliver them to the Emperor for adjudication. The plan failed. Those who had already accepted the implants were able to claim victory. Nevertheless, the event gained a certain amount of publicity, reaching the Council of Terror. For this reason, the Emperor publicly condemned Angron's actions and sent the legion of Daemon to the World Eaters, tasked with conveying to the brother the error of his ways, as well as stopping the dangerous practice of implanting butcher's nails. The meeting of the Primarchs on Genna went down in the history of the 12th Legion, under the name the Night of the Wolf. The World Eaters were weakened by the recently concluded campaign and met the arriving space wolves in blood-stained armor and with fresh wounds. Angron refused to acknowledge the authority of Daemon and demanded he leave before the situation turned into something regrettable. However, the Wolf King did not succumb to threats. He declared that the Emperor had tasked him with escorting the 12th Legion to Terra, where a tribunal would be conducted over Angron's actions, and all Space Marines would have the nails removed. Russ tried to convince his brother that his way of waging war was a senseless devastation, contrary to the ideals for which the Imperium fights. But Angron considered these words of the Wolf King naive deception, for in his opinion the Imperium waged wars for resources, lands, wealth, people whose labour could be exploited, and the opportunity to destroy anyone who voiced a different opinion. After all, the very idea of freedom is a nightmare for the Emperor, as he knows only slavery, veiled under the harmless word consent. To this day, it is unknown who fired the first shot. Even after decades, both legions continued to blame each other for starting the battle. Angron attacked his brother first with his famed chain-axe Widowmaker, which broke that night and was never used again. The battle became a source of pride and secret shame for both legions, as both the World Eaters and the Space Wolves subsequently proclaimed their victory loudly, but in reality feared they had lost, as the bloody conflict turned out to be inconclusive. Angron was convinced he had defeated his brother, as the vanquished Wolf King on the ground was forced to literally crawl away. However, a likely personal victory in a duel with Daemon did not equate to victory in battle. The great wolf indeed lay on the ground, but around the Primarch stood a circle of his sons, while the World Eaters did not think of their father, blinded by their own bloody contest. Had Daemon given the signal, the Space Wolves would have annihilated Angron, but this did not happen. The Emperor had ordered the World Eaters to be brought to heel, not battled, and Daemon did not wish to kill his own brother. The Primarch of the Wolves reproached Angron for remaining essentially a gladiator, fighting only for himself. But the Red Angel was uninterested in the cohesion of his legion and the loyalty of his sons. He did not consider them his family and could not grasp the tragedy of what was happening. Daemon was horrified by the losses on both sides and ordered the Space Wolves to retreat to avoid inflicting further damage on the Imperium. The World Eaters did not march on Terra, and their Primarch did not forsake the further implantation of the butcher's nails. Contrary to the Emperor's command, the Legion continued to function as Angron wished. Bloody rituals, including blood-drinking and gladiatorial combats to the death, became firmly rooted in the traditions of the World Eaters. Soon it became a common practice for the sons of Angron to compete with each other in the number of skulls taken in battle, leading to an even more uncontrollable bloodlust even outside of combat. And yet, the results of their conquests remained so effective that the Emperor was prepared to turn a blind eye to the World Eaters' inhuman cruelty for a long time to come. The unimaginable behaviour of the 12th Legion only worsened over the years, and more other Primarchs began to express their concerns to the Father. Having left the Great Crusade and gone to Terra, the Emperor ordered Horus Lupercal to accomplish what Daemon had failed to, deliver the World Eaters to the Throne World. However, by that period the War Master had already been corrupted by chaos and executed the order not as the Master of Mankind had expected. Horus had little trouble persuading Angron to take his side, as the former gladiator never hid his hatred for the Emperor. The War Master proclaimed that humanity needed a stronger leader, one who would not be swayed by a handful of mortal bureaucrats. These words resonated with Angron, but he joined the rebellion for another reason. He found it easier to endure Horus, whom he considered a self-satisfied scoundrel, than the monster who called himself the Emperor. The Red Angel led his legion during the first ground assault on Istvan III. After extensive bombardment, firestorms arose on the planet, hindering the final destruction of the survivors from orbit. Horus planned to wait until weather conditions improved, while the World Eaters simply wanted to begin the slaughter as soon as possible. The incensed War Master had no choice but to support his impulsive allies. However, the legionnaires of the 12th nearly driven mad with bloodlust, caused as much harm as they did good. They slaughtered loyalists, traitors, and even each other, reveling in the process and caring little for the approach of victory. At one of the next stages of the uprising, Horus ordered the World Eaters to join the Legion of the Word-Bearers in their attack on Ultramar Guilliman. This raid was of the utmost importance for the successful conclusion of the war, as it was intended to bleed the most numerous legion of the Loyalists dry and create a warp storm that would divide the galaxy in two. The World Eaters proved to be an ally for the Word-Bearers, whose might was as great as it was unpredictable. Even the journey to Ultramar was a real challenge, as Angron was ready to divert to any nearby enemies and had no intention of caring about carrying out Horus's order. With great difficulty, but Lorgar still managed to find a way to approach his nearly reckless brother. The two legions attacked the strategically important world of Armatura for the Ultramarines and ravaged it. However, Angron, like his sons, almost completely lost touch with what was happening during the battle and could not notice the cunning of the enemy. The Ultramarines managed to lure the Primarch and many of the World Eaters into the capital's headquarters and then blew it up, burying the followers of Chaos under tons of debris. The disoriented and pain-ridden Angron managed to escape only because the remaining librarians of the Legion again united and convinced the Primarch to move in the right direction. Meanwhile, Lorgar Aurelian, regardless of the boiling battle around him, was independently engaged in excavations, hoping to save Angron from under the rubble. Being in an unprotected position, the Golden Primarch was seriously injured and could have been crushed by Warhound Titans, but the escaped Angron protected him by holding the foot of the colossal machine over Lorgar. On Armatura, the Red Angel broke and discarded his two axes, Gorefather and Gorechild, which were subsequently picked up and restored by Captain Khan. At the same time, the Primarch of the Word-Bearers noted the progressing madness and guessed that the Butcher's Nails would kill Angron in the near future. The Primarch's implants acted more destructively than the mechanisms that were embedded in the heads of the Space Marines. Over the years, their harm only increased and eventually deprived Angron of the ability to sleep. His brain received the much-needed rest only during battles. Then the Primarch's consciousness temporarily cleared, and he could think, dream, remember. For a short time the nails gave Angron a tranquility, restless and fierce, like the calm in the centre of a storm. After the end of the battle, the emptiness granted by the implants was filled with pain and convulsions, causing Angron to potentially drop his axes. From the shame of the Primarch, chains saved him, with which the weapon was shackled to his wrists. His superhuman brain resisted, and because of this, the mechanisms of pain bit into him all the harder, gradually bringing him closer to a slow and excruciating death. Aurelian proved cunning enough to hide his suspicions from his brother, but not because he wanted to use him. On the contrary, Lorgar intended to find a way to heal the Red Angel. Under this pretext, Lorgar managed to convince Angron to return to his native planet, Nuceria, where, as the Golden Primarch claimed, one could find more information about ancient technology of mechanical implants. Lorgar promised that after obtaining the information, they could burn the despicable world and avenge those who long deserved the most terrible fate. Upon arriving on Nuceria, Angron immediately went to the site of the last battle, where he discovered numerous unburied skeletons. The planet's masters had taken their fallen, but the bodies of the rebellious gladiators were not even deemed worthy of burial, leaving them to be torn apart by wild animals and birds. The Red Angel still remembered the name of every warrior in his small army. Seeing the fate that had befallen them, Angron cried for the second time in his life. But the most terrifying discovery for him was something else. Lorgar led Angron to the palace of the ruler of Nuceria, who turned out to be a small boy bearing the same surname as the Primarch. After centuries of existence under the imperial truth, the planet had not made significant changes in its society, and the Thalkur dynasty, once owning Angron as property, continued to remain in power. Moreover, to maintain stability, the world's masters spread information claiming that the leader of the rebellious gladiators, Angron, had abandoned and betrayed his warriors. Angered by this lie, the Primarch ordered his legion to kill all people on the planet. Immediately after this, a fleet led by Robut Guilliman of the Ultramarines approached Nuceria. The battle between the legions was fought both in space and on the surface, as the Ultramarines arrived to avenge the Word-Bearers for the destruction of Kulth. Guilliman and Lorgar engaged in a duel that seemed unfathomable to the Space Marines surrounding them. Until this moment, None of the Astartes could imagine that a battle between brothers could be filled with such hatred. The Primarch of the Ultramarines broke Lorgar's breastplate, but the latter repelled him with a psychic effort. Perhaps Aurelian was not as powerful a warrior, but his increased psychic abilities fully compensated for this. Both Primarchs received severe injuries and fought, understanding that the battle's end would be the death of one of them. But into the battle intervened Angron. By that point, the remnants of the Red Angel's shattered armor were already completely covered in blood, and his chest adorned with a set of skulls of Nuceria's gladiators. The Primarch hoped that by bathing the remains of his fallen brothers in the blood of their enemies, he could pay tribute to them and, in some sense, atone for the guilt of his disappearance. During the battle, Guilliman accidentally tore off one of the skulls and stepped on it, which caused Angron incredible fury, even by the standards of the World Eaters. At the moment when Guilliman's boot crushed the skull and the Red Angel let out a scream of rage, Lorgar, feeling the tumult of the warp, began to sing a song in a language that no living being had used before. Summoning a deadly storm and tearing the sky with a crimson stream of ghosts from hundreds of slain worlds, Aurelian simultaneously saved his brother's life. Focusing on the triumphant figure of the wounded Angron, Lorgar called upon the Neverborn. In the process of ascension, the body of the Red Angel transformed into mercury, lava, unholy fire, and then burst into pieces and soared into the sky. The 19 remaining librarians of the World Eaters united and tore their father's soul from his body, trying in this way to protect him from desecration. They were convinced that they were saving Angron, but Lorgar, who ultimately proved to be psychically stronger, believed the same. Transformed into a demon prince of Khorne, the Red Angel first turned his attention to the librarians, whose mere presence had caused him pain for many years. In the eyes of the stunned Guilliman, Angron attacked his own sons, tearing them apart with his hands and teeth. The severely wounded Primarch of the Ultramarines was unable to understand who his brothers had become and retreated, while the World Eaters freely completed the extermination of all living things on the planet. Becoming a demon prince of Khorne, Angron shook the ashes of his native world from his feet and never reminisced about it again. The transformation freed him from the butcher's nails and, as Lorgar claimed, made the existence of the Blood Angel less torturous. The Golden Primarch sincerely believed that turning into a demon prince was Angron's only chance to be saved from a torturous death. Lorgar had not anticipated this, but the Red Angel appreciated his care. After the ascension, he saved Aurelian's life once again and called him brother. Returning on board his flagship, Angron ordered Khan to kill 300 slaves in the lower holds and build a massive throne from their skull. Around the same period, to enhance his martial skills and his new form, the Primarch received a black blade, which replaced the broken axes. In the following months, the World Eaters engaged in disorderly attacks on Imperial planets. They ignored the orders of Horus and did not intend to move to Ulanor for the preparation of the final battle for Terra. The next Primarch, who was tasked with finding and bringing Angron, was Perturabo. The Iron Warriors tracked down the World Eaters, finding them on a planet whose entire population had been slaughtered and piled into a gigantic mound of corpses. The deranged Space Marines of Khorne also attacked the sons of Perturabo, but received an equal response. In his demon form, Angron proved to be stronger and faster than his brother, but even the wounded Lord of Iron persisted in his conviction. Perturabo reminded Angron of his slave origins and the demise of the gladiators whom he could not protect. Enraged, the demon prince of Khorne fell for his words and joined Horus on the journey to Ulanor. Angron had no intention of fighting alongside Lupercal. His desire was for war against the Emperor. By the time the Siege of Terra began, the Red Angel was completely enslaved by the will of the Blood God. He refused to obey and demanded from Horus the permission to attack the Emperor's palace. The fact that a psychic barrier would kill him even before landing did not concern Angron. He wanted to commence the slaughter as soon as possible. So upon learning that the Death Guard had been entrusted with leading the attack on Terra, the Primarch flew into a furious rage and killed everyone unlucky enough to encounter him on the decks of the Conqueror. The crew was concerned for the safety of their flagship and their lives, foreseeing a disaster if Angron reached the Tech Priests. To prevent this, the World Eaters conspired with the Night Lords, on one of whose ships was a maze capable of isolating the Primarch until the beginning of the battle for Terra. Demons whispered to Angron that the true chosen of the Blood God was Khan, inducing a rage in the Primarch and a desire to confront his rival. However, the captain was unable to defeat the Demon Prince, and before he attempted to kill him, he managed to place a teleport on Angron, sending him into Conrad Kurz's labyrinth. This remarkable structure had been created by Perturabo at the request of Night Haunter and had previously been used for torturing Vulcan. Angron was fortunate, spending far less time in the maze than his brother from the Salamander's Legion. The traitors on Terra conducted a series of rituals that ultimately destroyed the psychic barrier of the Emperor, after which the Demon Prince of Khorne was ejected from the ship's hold onto the surface. Angron landed on Terra as a massive, blazing meteorite, whose shockwaves struck both allies and foes. Immediately after, he challenged Sanguinius, but the Primarch of the Blood Angels simply saluted him and disappeared into the palace, saying that the day when they would fight had not yet come. Enraged, Angron perceived this act as cowardice. According to the records of the World Eaters, it was their Primarch who broke through the gates of the Imperial Palace and was the first to enter inside, although sources from other traitor legions contradict this. In the final battle for Terra, after Horus fell at the hands of the Emperor, the Chaos Army disintegrated and fled into the Eye of Terror. Angron was the last to retreat, looking back at the palace that had withstood his fury. He led the remnants of the World Eaters to a demonic world created by Khorne specifically for them. Although the Space Marines soon began to kill each other, and the legions splintered into warring factions that scattered across the galaxy. Over the millennia following the heresy, Angron rarely left the Eye of Terror, engaging in wars in the name of Khorne against other forces of chaos. However, there are a few documented instances of the Demon Prince emerging into the material realm. These include campaigns known in the archives of the Imperium as the Dominion of Fire and the First War for Armageddon, during which Angron's demonic Black Blade was destroyed by a Psyker of the Grey Knights. Each of the Primarchs who turned away from the light of the Emperor had their own reason for betrayal. Some grievances were inflated from trivialities that, with the help of the gods of chaos, gained profound meaning. Others were reactions to what the fallen sons of the Master of Mankind saw as injustice. Yet Angron's case fits neither of these scenarios, for he never swore fealty to the Emperor.